One Yechudzaslacha. Welcome to Exploring Alaska Native Voices, a show about the evolving character of Alaska indigenous life in a world society. As this song says, come together, all as one.
Look at a map of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula. You can't help but notice a large body of water. Dena'ina Lake, fed by glaciers extending down the Kenai Mountains from the massive Harding ice field. It's the source of the Kasilof River, which flows into Cook Inlet. It takes in 76,000 acres, is 5 miles across at its widest point, 25 miles long, and deep in history. And the surrounding country? Breathtaking scenery, abundant game, and rich in culture. Although now mostly a wilderness, back at the turn of the last century this area attracted a considerable number of hunters, guides, and trappers who also made a living working the canneries along Cook Inlet. It's a bit off the beaten path, there are no roads leading in, but come with us as we travel by water and on foot to see what's in the heart of the Kenai Peninsula. Hidden along the shoreline we find a collection of cabins, a last testament to a sourdough's mark on the land. Of course, Mother Nature's mark on the land is everywhere, but most dominated by the Dena'ina Glacier. Dan Mortensen lives halfway up the 17-mile-long Kasilof River. He's lived there since 1975, knows the country well, and he'll be our guide up to the glacier itself and around the lake.
Well, it's Dena'ina Glacier. It's a nice, easy walk up here. It's just a beautiful spot. Beautiful. The glacier has receded. I've been coming up here for 20 some years. Probably 25 years, and the glacier used to end right here.
The lake is located within the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, and so will remain just the way it is. Another who knows his way around the land of the Big T is Gary Titus. He's a ranger and historian with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He's also written extensively about the area.
Well, this is the start of big game hunting in Alaska is right here in Dena'ina Lake. 1897, Andrew Berg guided a hunter from Colorado for big game, Dall DeWeese, the world's largest moose right here in the Kenai Peninsula. And Daud Elise went back to Colorado and wrote articles for the sportsman magazines, and the word was out that the Kenai Peninsula was the place to go.
Based on the journals of Andrew Berg, Gary co-authored a book called Alaska's #1 Guide, along with Catherine Cassidy, detailing the life of one whom you might say has that mountain man image but is ultimately just a man.
Andrew Berg first came to Alaska in 1888 from Finland. In 1897, Daud Elise came searching for big moose. He was told to contact Andrew Berg at the Kasilof Cannery, that Andrew was known as the best moose hunter.
On reaching Kasilof, I found Mr. Berg and soon decided from his talk that he was a good hunter and knew where the moose lived, as well as bear and white mountain sheep. He is 26 years old, 6 feet tall, 198 pounds weight, and is one of the strongest men I have ever met. He said he would go with me if he could get off from the cannery. I went to the superintendent, who very kindly arranged for his release. Dall DeWeese, September 9th, 1897.
Daud Elise was a businessman from Colorado. He also wrote many articles regarding his hunts on the Kenai Peninsula. Daud Elise was also responsible for helping to establish the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. In 1898, in 1901, he started to see a decrease in the game populations on the Kenai. He wrote a letter to the president saying something must be done to save the game on the Kenai Peninsula.
A letter to the president dated December 1st, 1901. This is a subject that appeals to every true-blood sportsman, every lover of animal life, and all those who see beauty in nature, embracing forests, plains, and mountains throughout our entire country. And while the woods, plains, and mountains are naturally beautiful, we all agree that they are much more grand and lifelike when the wild animals and birds are present. There are now several organizations doing work toward the preservation of wild animal and bird life. There is much yet for us to do. To resolve is to act. Let us be up and at it. The natives are very destructive to sheep, I have seen. I have seen them in parties of their own shoot sheep, and if it ran off wounded or fell over a low cliff, they never went after it. When in my party, I never allow a native to carry a gun. Make a law that prohibits sportsmen or other persons from employing natives or other men for killing big game animals or birds, for in doing so, most of the meat is wasted and the heads shipped and sold. Dall DeWeese, Canon City, Colorado.
My name is Alan Boras. I'm an anthropology professor at Kenai Peninsula College. Many of the letters and other documents from Andrew Berg and other guides and related individuals paint a very negative picture of Dena'ina men and Dena'ina in general, referring to them not by their name but as boy. My native boy did this, or referring to supposed willfully killing of animals and wanton waste of those animals by native peoples. And we have to look at the context of this. What was emerging around 1900 and in the early part of the 20th century was a class society, and generally speaking, there was a white top class, and then natives were considered second-class citizens in their own homeland by that emerging class society. And there are ways that dominant groups marginalize indigenous peoples. References to terms like boy, without giving the name, without saying who they were, right? Not personalizing it, or pointing the finger at various atrocities they may have committed. But of course, there's no other record of whether they actually did those sorts of things, and often there's a hidden agenda for all of this. Some of the guides saw the native men who knew the territory well. They knew the territory like the back of their hand. They would have been excellent guides for anyone who wanted to come in and hunt, but criticized their hunting abilities and their guiding abilities, obviously because they were in competition with those, and the word gets out, and so a client coming in, well, don't hire a native guide because they're untrustworthy, they smell bad, they smell like salmon, all these things are in these documents. Therefore, who? Hire the white guide, hire the guy who will treat you well, even though they may not know the land any better. They didn't necessarily have a better ethic in terms of the animals. In fact, there's lots of evidence to suggest that the Dena'ina ethic in terms of hunting was of the highest order. So one can't take all these letters at face value. One has to understand the context. Who's writing the letter and for what purpose? What's their agenda? This spear point was found in the high country near Nikanorka Mountain at the head of Tustumena Lake by then a young man who was hiking. And it is one of the few evidences of use in that high country because of the fact that the Dena'ina did not leave much lying about, and this was probably found by accident, or lost by accident. They also believed that the things that they had themselves had an essence to them. It's called begesh. Begesh is sort of a spirit associated with a spear or an arrow or any element that you might have. And it would be considered offensive to animals to leave anything lying about where they might detect that begesh inadvertently. It would be like an infringement in their life. Consequently, whatever activity they did, hunting activity, fishing activity, they tried to leave no trace. They left nothing. They didn't build a cabin. They built a brush camp and they dismantled the brush camp. They left no artifacts lying about. They were very careful to collect everything so there was no trace. Interestingly, when the first whites came into the area, they would see no evidence of native activity up and down the Kasilof or up and down the Kenai rivers because the Dena'ina had been very careful to leave no trace, so in the mind of the first trappers and the first guides, there was no evidence that there were any Indians that had ever occupied, but it was absolutely not the case.
After Dall DeWeese hunt on the Dena'ina Lake in 1897, he returned to Colorado, where he wrote articles for Forest and Stream magazine about his hunt on the Kenai Peninsula. Well, of course, these articles inspired all the big game hunters throughout the world to seek the world's largest moose. The hunters were very wealthy men that came up here. The whole hunt would take a month to 2 months, including travel time, a month in the field, and then travel time back to where they came from. The hunts usually started in August and went through about mid-October. Before the outboard engine in airplanes, they had to line their boats up the river. In this process was one man in front, or 2 men or 3 men in front with a long rope, which was connected to the bow of the boat. And usually another man stood in the stern of the boat with a long stick, which was pushing the stern off the shore. Going up the Kasilof would take 2 to 3 days from the ocean up to Dena'ina Lake. Some of the hunters would shoot small game, birds and other small game, as the guides and packers did all the work of getting the boat up. And the hunters would meet the guides at the next camp along the river. The moose were sought after for their large antler size. And the hunters took out the antlers of the moose and the horns of the sheep. They ate some meat, but otherwise they didn't take any meat out. And they were conservationists, and they were very, very strong conservationists. To them, this was not unethical. We cannot put our ethics today to their ethics back then, because a different time, different place. Today, you see many old cabins along the shores of Dena'ina Lake. These cabins were the residence of trappers. They trapped lynx, mink. Those are the 2 big animals they trapped, the money makers. But these cabins on the shore were their home cabins. And then from there, they had trap lines to different trap cabins. The trap cabins were usually about what they could do in 1 day's walk running a trap line. And they run this trap line for a day, 2 days, then come back to their home cabin.
Andrew used to go hunting all by himself at times, just for the fun of it. He'd tie a piece of bacon to a rope, knot the other end of the rope around his leg. Then he'd wrap up in his heavy overcoat and lie down to sleep. Pretty soon an old brownie would come along, sniffing around for something to eat. He'd find the bacon and take a bite. That would jerk the rope and wake Andrew. Then Andrew would pull the rope toward him, and the bear would follow the bacon. When the bear got up close, Andrew would shoot it. Then he'd come back to Kenai and tell us all about it. He got some mighty big bears that way. January 1946, Alaska Sportsman's Magazine.
The cannery at the mouth of the Kasilof River was a source of employment for many of these trappers. They would trap up on Dena'ina Lake all winter and then come down to Kasilof in the summertime, where they were employed in the fisheries, commercial fisheries operations. On Dena'ina, there was quite a few trappers that would spend a winter on the lake, and they each had their own cabin. Andrew Berg was on Indian Creek. At Moose Creek, Wendy Wagner had a cabin. All that remains on Moose Creek today is 2 log buildings. One was used as a sauna, and that was built in the 20s. Another one was used as just a storage shed.
While many structures along the lake have disappeared through neglect or fire, O'Dell's Lodge has been fully restored by Eric Hips and Catherine Cassidy, who have one of the few inholdings within the refuge. The facelift began by stripping the structure right down to the bare wood.
There are just 3 private inholdings on Dena'ina Lake. Inholdings were headquarters site established by big game guides. In 1926, The Alaska Guides Association started a lodge on the shores of Dena'ina Lake. Tom O'Dell started with them in 1926. That winter, he built a cabin just west of the Alaska Guides Camp and started his own guiding business. The Alaska Guides became very well known in the territory, and they employed all the big game guides on the Kenai into one group.
In fact, back in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Alaska Guides Association was the largest organization of its kind in the world. Its Birchwood Base Camp included wall tents, dressing tables, spring beds, and clean sheets. Only the highest standards for clients that included some well-known personalities.
Andy Simons, probably the most well-known of the big game guides of that era, started in the teens and became one of the best-known guides on the Kenai. Andy Simons' first client was Mr. Jeffries, the world champion, heavyweight boxing champion. With the popularity of their airplane, Andy Simons mentioned that hunting has changed and not for the better. A story he said was that you never got to know a man until you shared a sack of flour with him. And that comment came because the big game hunts used to last 30 days. With the airplane coming in, it just changed the hunt.
Some of the old cabins, about a half dozen or so that dot the lake, are still available for use today, providing a welcome refuge from sudden storms or just a place to rest after a long day.
At this time, the cabins on the Kenai Peninsula are open to public use. The cabins are protected by laws. These are very important sites, and I look at them as a big jigsaw puzzle. You take something from the cabin, we can never complete the picture.
While traveling through this backcountry, even all the way up to Tustumena Glacier, one finds that other than those few cabins remaining along the lake, there's little evidence of human activity. But it only seems that way. In fact, today's wilderness ethic of leave no trace is really not very new. Evidence of native peoples goes back to about 1000 BC in what's called the Riverine Kachemak culture. More recently, those we now know as the Dena'ina can be traced back to around 1000 AD.
The Dena'ina, the modern Kenai, elaborate culture that functioned very well and very sustainably from about 1000 AD until Russians came. The native villages on the Kasilof, there were two at the mouth of the Kasilof. One was Humpy Point, or Humpy's Village, and the other was Californsky Village. The first years of Russian occupation on the Kenai Peninsula were very acrimonious between Russians and the Dena'ina. Two major epidemics that afflicted the Dena'ina people. And the statistics appear that up to half of the Dena'ina died in that epidemic. A horrific event that interestingly caused a shift to orthodoxy as a way to explain some of the events that may have happened in connection with that. The message of orthodoxy through the missionization efforts of the priests was that things happened because of God's will. We don't know the plan, but things would happen for God's will. What emerged was not a wholesale conversion to orthodoxy, but the Dena'ina people sort of held two ideologies in their head, two religions in their head. The traditional view that dealt with nature, that explained things of nature and how the animals behaved. And then this newer view of orthodoxy that was attributed to the community and explained things of how the changes were occurring, and sort of had this duality in one's mind. And that probably lasted well into the 20th century.
My childhood bedtime stories usually began with "A long time ago in Kenai." The characters and actions in the stories told by my maternal grandmother at Kenai Dena'ina were different from the heroes and heroines presented by Walt Disney on Sunday evenings or portrayed in the books I checked out from the school library. Her characters did stupid things. they acted brashly or cowardly, but could also be wise, strong, loving, and kind. She based many of her stories on actual people and used their actions to teach me values. One of Grandma's stories focused on the power of ancient Dena'ina graves and the severe consequences to be faced by those who desecrated them or who did not show proper respect. She insisted that we never run or skip past the graveyard. We were to walk calmly and quietly. One of the men she talked about was Andrew Berg, who used a human skull as a sugar bowl and laughed at the reactions of his Dena'ina visitors who recoiled in shock and alarm or who refused to remain in the cabin. She then went on to say that he suffered almost unbearable pain in his later life, just as many before him had suffered for not showing proper respect. My Uncle Herm told me the other half of the Andrew Berg story. Andrew Berg frequently visited his brother and friends in Kenai when my uncle was young. During his visit, Andrew filled his pockets with round pink peppermints and handed them out to the young people in the village, never discriminating between white and native. Many young Kenai men adopted this custom, perhaps to show their respect for Andrew's strength and hunting skills, or to perpetuate a cherished memory. People offering candy to all the children in the village of Kenai were rare in the 1930s. I plucked many an Andrew Berg from my uncle's or his hunting and trapping partners' pockets. To this day, the sight and taste of this distinct candy brings to mind both my grandmother's admonishing story and the cherished memory of being told to find the Andrew Berg.
A real significant event happened in 1882 with the Second Cannery in Alaska being established at the mouth of the Kasilof River. This was a huge cannery. It was a large operation. It was financed by essentially railroad capital, railroad barons from San Francisco who had the capital to establish these large canneries.
Large runs of salmon drew a significant migration of resource nomads to Cook Inlet. Sailing schooners, after a long journey, anchored well offshore. Everything from huge steam boilers to nails had to be shuttled to shore.
Most of the people who worked early on in the gut line were Chinese labor, and it tended to be Scandinavian and other fishermen who operated the traps. A number of Dena'ina and other natives were also employed in these canneries. And the wage structure is kind of interesting. The white fishermen received about $350 for a summer's pay. The native fishermen about half of that, and the Chinese about half of that again, so there was a definite wage structure. The Dena'ina tended to become second-class citizens in their own homeland. That was exacerbated by a process that is called debt peonage. The company store would give very easy credit to, in this case, the Dena'ina, manufactured goods that weren't otherwise available. You had to borrow again to make it through the winter. From the cannery standpoint, it assured them of a labor force because you were always 1 year behind in paying off your debt. This had a momentous effect on Dena'ina society. Up to that point, the Dena'ina had a clan-based system where essentially your labor was contributed to the clan for fishing and other subsistence purposes. Inadvertently, the canneries had this transforming effect on Dena'ina society, shifting it from these matrilineal clans to individual families operating independently, working for the canneries, paying off their debts. The Orthodox priests tended to act as advocates for the Dena'ina people in the face of adversity that may have come from canneries. There was lots of drinking, alcoholism was associated with canneries. Native women were subject to whatever men might do, and so the priests acted as advocates, as middlemen, so to speak, between the Dena'ina community and the canneries and related developments that were happening. As a consequence of these large canneries moving in, a lot of whites, non-natives, came north. Most went back. but a number stayed, and increasingly through the early part of the 20th century, more and more stayed. It wasn't, however, until about 1930 that the non-native population exceeded the native population in Kenai and related places. So it was still primarily a native town, native village, native area. The people who came sort of are of two types. Some came and married into the Kenai tribe. They married Dena'ina women, they established families, they became community members, and they became part of the community. And many of the families today are descended from that union that live in Kenai. The others were bachelor farmers, to use that word, but in this case, bachelor trappers or bachelor fishermen. And Andrew Berg is typical of one of those. Never married, lived somewhat as a recluse, had immense skills, because one of the things a community does is it provides a mutual support group. But these were people who wanted to live largely by themselves and had the skills to do it. But that said, by the same token, they didn't contribute to the larger community as a whole. They were individualists. In a way, they were very self-indulgent. They had their trap line, they did their thing. Had not Andrew Berg written a diary of his experiences, we would know almost nothing about him today. In other words, their impact was minimal. He left a few cabins and he left a diary, and therefore we know of these individuals. But the real community builders were those that were integrating with the community, the Dena'ina people themselves, and the people who married into the community and engaged in that other struggle, equally, maybe more difficult, of building a community and building a place.
But what remains today is a community known as Kasilof, although its residents are still independent enough to remain unincorporated. And some descendants of early settlers, and others more recent, working through the Kasilof Historical Society, are working to preserve the rich heritage of Tustumena country.
Thanks so much for watching Exploring Alaska. See you next time. For more info about Alaska or our show, check out our website at exploringalaska.com.